This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. News, speculation, and concern tonight about the long reach of Colombian cocaine cartel criminals and their appetite for violence, terror, and retaliation in North America. Law enforcement officials in the United States and Canada now are trying to find out who and what is behind a group of Latin American men now in custody in Canada. Authorities know they were heavily armed. CBS News law correspondent Rita Braver reports they want to know a lot more.
Police in Edmonton, Canada are holding 4 Latin American men on illegal weapons charges tonight. But no one seems sure who the men are or why they were traveling with a huge cache of arms, including assault rifles, automatic pistols, tear gas, a grenade, 3,000 rounds of ammunition, and an inflatable raft.
Innocent! What are you doing here? Innocent!
They were reportedly carrying Venezuelan passports, but U.S. law enforcement officials say at least 2 of the men are believed to be Colombians. A 5th man linked to the group was arrested separately as he tried to rent a car. Law enforcement officials say they can only speculate on the group's mission. At first, there was concern the men might be headed for President Bush's compound across the main border in Kennebunkport. But White House officials say the Secret Service has ruled out that possibility. And tonight, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police said they are certain the group planned no attacks on any U.S. or Canadian officials. There is some speculation that the men were trying to open a new drug or gun smuggling operation between Canada and the U.S. They apparently carried maps with certain cities marked. But Canadian police said the most likely theory is that the men planned to disrupt the drug trial of 2 Colombians now underway about 125 miles southeast of Edmonton. Security there was strengthened today. What does the U.S. officially know about the group?
I have no idea what the basis of the case is, only that they have been arrested and that it's a Canadian case. That's the extent of my knowledge, and that we are cooperating.
The Edmonton 5 have now been moved to a high-security prison facility. They'll be back in court for further proceedings next week. Rita Braver, CBS News, Washington.
Inside Colombia, a quick and violent response from the cocaine cartel scum just hours after the government's latest promise to extradite 2 more big-time dealers to face U.S. justice. Correspondent Richard Threlkel reports on bank bombings in Bogota and why the siege of drugs and terror is so hard to stop.
Drug traffickers set off powerful bombs at 3 banks in downtown Bogota overnight, injuring 1 person and doing considerable damage. And they kept the capital on edge today with a number of bomb threats, what the police call a campaign of telephone terror. The drug lords' violent retaliation to the government's crackdown has so shocked and outraged all Colombians you'd think they'd be clamoring to enlist in the war on drugs. They're not, and not just because they're frightened. The prosperity enjoyed by the privileged few in the glittering high-rises doesn't trickle down to the 4/5 of the population who are have-nots and are more worried about where their next meal is coming from.
The average Colombian lives in poverty. 40% lives in absolute poverty. It's a society that has one of the worst distribution of incomes in the world.
Even those lucky enough to have a job can hardly make ends meet. A typical factory worker earns the equivalent of $100 a month. That's one reason why Colombians have been content to tolerate their drug lords and even envy their lifestyle, and why the 50,000 Colombians who work for them take their money, no questions asked.
They are trying to survive first, and when you're trying to survive, you don't care if the money you're having it's bad money, or if it's narco money, or if it's guerrilla money, or it's in the United States money. I mean,
It's money.
it's money.
Ask people on the street whether the drug problem is important, and they'll tell you, no, what is important is work. Work is the most important thing for us, she says. And they'll tell you, no es mi guerra, it's not my war. Colombians seem a little puzzled why, if Americans are so upset about cocaine, they don't just kick their habit. And why, if Washington's really serious about its war on drugs, it recently voted to scrap the International Coffee Agreement, dropping world coffee prices 50%. Colombia's a major coffee producer, and the U.S. decision is going to cost Colombia almost $500 million and 100,000 jobs, tempting a lot of coffee growers here to switch to a more lucrative cash crop, coca for cocaine. So if Washington isn't winning many hearts and minds here in its war against drugs, it's because most Colombians are preoccupied with a much older, more immediate struggle, the struggle for survival. Richard Threlkeld, CBS News, Bogota.
Economic news for Americans that's as welcome as Indian summer. The Commerce Department today reported a narrowing in the nation's troublesome trade deficit, a special shot of cheer for industrial workers. And meanwhile, the Labor Department said that wholesale prices in August dropped for the third straight month, the first time that's happened in more than 3 years. CBS News business correspondent Ray Brady has some perspective on all this.
Today's trade figures surprise some economists, but not the workers at this medical supply company. Each week, they've been shipping more and more testing equipment to overseas customers. Already, that's 10% of their total sales.
I would expect with the EECC in 1992 that the European market could be as much as 50% of our business.
What's surprising about the figures, the dollar has risen in recent months, making it more expensive for foreigners to buy U.S. goods. That slowed exports a bit. Still, Americans bought fewer foreign products, so the trade deficit narrowed to just below $7.6 billion, the lowest in nearly 5 years.
My reaction is that it's a superb set of numbers. I think we're doing fabulously.
One reason, say economists, American manufacturers have managed to lower costs enough to boost exports of heavy equipment, industrial supplies, and other items.
Between 85 and 1989, American companies got lean and mean, got serious about being more competitive, put a much stronger emphasis on export markets.
You really don't have a choice anymore about whether you should export. You have to export because the world has become one marketplace.
Here at home, gasoline prices were down 12% last month, and that meant wholesale prices dropped again, this time by 0.4%. Though some economists argue other prices are going up. But while the outlook for inflation may be still uncertain, economists say foreign trade is becoming the key to America's economic growth. Every time a company sells $40,000 worth of goods abroad, it's estimated, one more job's created at home. Ray Brady, CBS News, New York.
And still to come on the CBS Evening News, correspondent Richard Schlesinger with a story about jobs to break the cycle of poverty and drugs in our one nation under siege. U.S. military officials today are still trying to pinpoint exactly what went wrong during a test of an MX missile yesterday. Defense Department correspondent David Martin reports the MX is only the latest high-tech, important, but expensive weapon to undergo a test and fail it.
The MX missile, after a test program the Air Force said was close to perfect, an operational missile is taken from its silo and fired over the Pacific. Yesterday, 2 minutes after launch, the $75 million missile failed.
But at this point, I cannot tell you what the anomaly was.
The Trident II missile, consistently rated by Congress as one of the Pentagon's best-run weapons programs. But this is what happened the first time the Navy tried to launch it from a submarine. So far, 2 of 3 underwater shots have failed.
These problems cropped up only after billions of dollars already had been invested, and they raise questions about the Pentagon's ability to manage its increasingly sophisticated hardware.
Weapon systems are getting so complex that I don't think our approach to test and evaluation has caught up with the complexity of the weapon systems.
For one thing, the Pentagon cannot pay enough to attract the talent needed to handle the technology.
We're asking someone to manage a billion-dollar development program, and we won't pay them as much as we pay a first-year lawyer.
Sometimes the Pentagon wants a weapon so badly it rushes it into production without adequate testing. Funds for all 100 B-1 bombers were already committed before Congress found out the electronics didn't perform as advertised.
We ought to be spending the money on heavy testing up front. Make sure the darn thing works. Once we're sure of that, then you get into manufacturing.
More testing costs more money, but with declining defense budgets, the Pentagon is already under orders from Congress to reduce the cost of state-of-the-art weapons like the stealth bomber. One way to do that is cut back on testing and worry later about how well it works. David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon.
The White House science advisor to President Bush today approved the October 12th launch aboard the space shuttle of the $1.4 billion Galileo spacecraft to explore Jupiter. Formal White House approval was required because the Galileo is equipped with nuclear power packs. Some environmental groups plan to file suit to prevent the launch, citing the possibility of a nuclear contamination in any accident. NASA insists the danger of radioactive fallout is minimal, even in the event of a shuttle launch disaster. Samuel Pierce, former Housing and Urban Development Secretary for all 8 years of the Reagan-Bush administration, failed to appear as a witness today before a congressional panel. That panel is looking into accusations of mismanagement and deep corruption at HUD during the 1980s and questions about what Pierce himself did or did not do. Correspondent Terrence Smith is following this story.
I will now call the witness, Mr. Sam Pierce, to the witness table.
Denouncing the former HUD Secretary's failure to appear as capricious and deceitful, Chairman Tom Lantos said the subcommittee will take the extraordinary step of forcing Pierce to testify under subpoena. The committee is probing contradictory testimony about Pierce's role in the influence peddling scandal that has enveloped his former agency. Lantos ridiculed Pierce's excuse that he couldn't find a Washington lawyer to represent him until early this month.
Now, I could understand having difficulty finding affordable housing in Washington, but not an attorney.
Pierce's newly hired lawyers said their client is in hiding.
And we will produce our client voluntarily. He wants to appear voluntarily and tell his side of the story.
Visiting a housing project in Chicago, Pierce's successor said he is determined to clean up the agency.
We're going to make the HUD work for needy people, not greedy people.
An internal HUD document obtained by CBS News outlines a sweeping plan Kemp is considering to accomplish that. His proposed reform initiative includes sprucing up the agency's image by changing its name to the Home Department, selling 50,000 foreclosed homes from the government's portfolio within 100 days, and funding more drug programs in public housing.
And I pledge to you that we're going to reform it from top to bottom and from stem to stern and take out the middle man who's ripping off the poor.
The committee is expected to subpoena Pierce to testify later this month. Even if he does appear, some members are already calling for the appointment of a special prosecutor to conduct a nationwide criminal probe into the HUD scandal. Terrence Smith, CBS News, Washington.
Former President Ronald Reagan left a Minnesota hospital and headed home by plane to California today. Mr. Reagan had skull surgery a week ago to remove what was called a buildup of fluid on the brain, reportedly the result of his horseback riding accident in Mexico in July. Mr. Reagan tipped his hat to well-wishers today, revealing the shave spot on his head. It may have been a historic turning point for South Africa. Just days after police turned guns, whips, and dogs on anti-election demonstrators, the new president ordered police to stand aside and allow peaceful protests against apartheid. Demonstrators filled the streets today in Johannesburg. Richard Wagner was there.
In a scene unthinkable even a week ago, tens of thousands of South Africans, black and white, protested in Johannesburg today, furthering the movement on behalf of oppressed people here, which is every day gathering momentum. It was the second large demonstration in 3 days in South Africa, protesting alleged police brutality. The government has permitted the demonstrations to take place. Activists displayed the communist flag and the banner of the outlawed anti-apartheid African National Congress. Even a white policeman carried a placard protesting police abuse. The government of new President F.W. de Klerk seems to be saying nonviolent protest is now acceptable, and in so doing may be turning an irrevocable corner. The organizers of today's protest are demanding that de Klerk now renounce apartheid. The march was led by the Reverend Frank Chikane, a religious leader who was once tortured in the police station where the march ended. Today, he asked to be admitted to that same station to present a petition for peace.
Can we come in and do it then?
Chikane was admitted. Advocates of equality here hope this may be the week in which the weight of the people in the streets began to bend the hardline apartheid system. Richard Wagner, CBS News, Johannesburg.
Meeting with out-of-town reporters in Washington today, President Bush lamented the loss of life in yesterday's shooting rampage in Louisville. A disgruntled former worker shot 20 of his former co-workers with an assault rifle, killing 7 of them before he killed himself. But Mr. Bush said he still opposes any legislation to ban assault rifles. The president said, and I quote him now, "If you have somebody who is deranged, and I don't want to prejudice this poor soul, but if he was deranged, I'm afraid you're going to have an incident like this," end of quotation. Mr. Bush said about the families of the dead, and again I quote, "I would tell them that I feel horrible about the loss of life. I would tell them that we must do everything we can to enforce laws that are already on the books," end of quotation. Germans reaching the West neared 14,000 today, the biggest exodus since the communist government put up the Berlin Wall in 1961. As correspondent Anthony Mason reports, for some of these refugees, the flight through Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Austria has been just a long end run around the wall.
This is Mike Ziegler's neighborhood in East Berlin, but don't look for him in his apartment on Willy Bredelstrasse. Late last night, the 25-year-old electrician and his family landed in West Berlin with a plane load of East German refugees. For some, separated by the Cold War, this was a moment of reunion. This brother and sister hadn't seen each other for 4 years. But Mike Ziegler was met only by a distant friend and the offering of a flower from a local insurance salesman. He'd come west with his wife Annette and their 5-year-old daughter Steffi, but the rest of their family was still on the other side of the wall. For the Zieglers, it had been a long and lonesome journey. They told the East German government they wanted to vacation in Hungary and instead headed straight for a refugee camp in Budapest. For the past week, they've been climbing on and off buses, moving from tent to tent, waiting for officials to call their name and clear them to go on to the next refugee camp. A car brought them through Austria. The train took them to Nuremberg, where they were promised a plane would take them on to Berlin. When last night they were finally given seats on a flight, the trip from East Berlin to Budapest, to the border and on into West Germany, had taken them in a 1,000-mile circle for what, were it not for the Berlin Wall, would have been a walk across the street. From a rooftop along the wall today, Mike Ziegler looked over at his old home in the east. "There it is," he said, "the white building. That was the window of my daughter's room." The wall will now keep him from his brother, his parents, but for freedom, he said, "I'd do it again." Thousands of relatives have been reunited because of the remarkable exodus this week, but yet another family has been broken apart. Anthony Mason, CBS News, West Berlin.
Robert Penn Warren, winner of Pulitzer Prizes for poetry and fiction, died today. He died at his summer home in Stratton, Vermont. A family friend said the 84-year-old Warren had been battling cancer for 3 years. Warren is perhaps most widely known for his novel, All the King's Men, which won a Pulitzer in 1947 and was made into an Academy Award-winning movie. Dan Rather for the CBS Evening News. Bob Schieffer will be here tomorrow. Don't forget the premiere of a new season for 60 Minutes Sunday night. I'll see you Monday. Good night.
This is CBS.